Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming to this Bright Blue event in partnership with Independent Age and the Centre for Ageing Better. And the event is called Mature Policymaking, Protective Policies for Pensioners. So my name's Sam. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at Bright Blue. And in case you don't know about us, Bright Blue's an independent think tank and pressure group for liberal conservatism. So we work across seven major areas in terms of our research and policy, including bountiful economy, clean environment, good lives, rewarding work, empowering government, just institutions, and connected communities. Social media-wise, please feel free to join in the discussion using the hashtag BrightBlue and hashtag CPC22, and do follow at We Are Bright Blue, as well as at Independent Age and at Aging_Better. So obviously we're in a very turbulent economic and political world. I think it's fair to say. But really, the name of the game with this panel today is I'm thinking about the long term, thinking about solving some of the persistent issues that demographically we are facing, including how we fund and fix social care, how we manage the changing nature of our population. So we'll be talking about a few different topics relating to this, but just to give a brief overview, we'll be discussing what the socio-economic consequences of the changing number and type of older people in the UK will be, whether the political consensus, as it were, around how to solve these issues is breaking down, and if it is, how do we build a new consensus? And we'll also be asking, are our institutions and our politics equipped to deal with these long-term strategic policy challenges? And obviously, we'll be hoping to hear some potential solutions. How do we rise to these challenges and kind of get on the front foot for some of these issues and challenges coming down the line. So I'm joined today by a wealth of expertise. To my immediate right is the Right Honourable Damian Green. Damian is the chair of the One Nation group of Conservative MPs, and he's been First Secretary of State and the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. And then just one space along, on my far right, is Dr. Carole Easton, the Chief Executive of the Centre for Ageing Better. And right on my left is Morgan Vine. Morgan is the Head of Policy and Influencing at Independent Age. And there's next to Morgan we will have, as of 20 past we hope, Ben Kentish. So Ben is the Westminster editor and presenter at LBC. So worth mentioning that if you're joining us online, digital viewers can ask questions through the Slido link located next to or below the video player. So we'll just kick off the discussion with some opening remarks from our speakers before we move to some Q&A. So Damian, perhaps you'd like to kick us off.
Thank you very much. And I'll start with the basics for those who don't know them. There are 12 million people in the UK over the age of 65, and by 2030, 1 in 5 of us will be over 65. And in 50 years, there are projected to be another 8.6 million people age 65 and over. And so it will become both larger in, as it were, real terms, but also larger as a proportion of the population. I'm tempted to say that in a week where Conservative Party polling ratings have not been great, the thought of having an increasingly ageing population is historically tremendously good news for the Conservative Party. But that's not the point of today. The sort of exam question that Bright Blue has set us is, are our institutions adapting to this and coping with this? To which my answer is no, not at all, except in the pensions field, where we have acknowledged that people live longer, and that the old model of essentially you spend the first 20 years of your life being dependent on other people and getting your education, then you work for 40 or 45 years and generate your own, as it were, spending, but also hopefully generate enough savings so that you can then live for another 10 years or so before you die. And that model does not work in a society where what lies beneath those figures I gave at the start is the fact that people can expect to live into their 90s. So if you stop work sometime in your 60s, you may well have another 30 years of life that you want to live to the full. So therefore, you'll need both health and economic ability to do so. And just the maths tell you that if you live to 90 and you're only working for about 40 years of that, you're going to have to generate a hell of a lot of wealth and savings in that 40 years to make you viable at either end of your life. And it doesn't work. And as I say, successive governments, including me when I was working pension secretary, have pushed the pension age up by a year so that the pension system the state pension remains affordable and can remain at a level where it keeps people out of poverty. I'm not claiming much more for it than that, but at least it does that. If we kept paying it at the old levels, then it would be reduced to levels where it wouldn't do that, which would be worse. But in every other way, both public and, in a sense, private sector policy has not adapted to this new world. And I commend to everyone to read the book The 100-Year Life, which sets this out in personal terms of how we should all assume we're going to do at least 2 or 3 careers. We should all try and take a midlife break so that instead of having the traditional gap year, if you like, before you go to university, what you should do is probably take a gap year in your 40s and use that to retrain for a completely new career, which may not well have existed when you were 20 and going into the workforce for the first time. So there are all kind of radical proposals for how we could all live our own lives differently. But there are also massive public policy implications about what we should do with that, because if people are going to do that, then in your 40s you're quite likely you will have commitments, you may well have children, you've got mortgages and so on, and so the government is going to have to support that. One of the great phrases and cliches that I've heard in innumerable times and uttered in my 25 years as an MP is lifelong learning. I don't detect any greater commitment to lifelong learning in this country now than I did 25 years ago. We talk about it a lot. We don't do it. And by we, I mean not just government, or in this case local government, but we as individuals, the number of people who actually take seriously the thought of reskilling themselves during their life is still lamentably small. And the third area I would warn about, this is, as it were, contemporary politics, but it could have huge long-term consequences, is health. That it's not just lifespan we need to increase, it's health span. And in a little-known bit, or a little red bit of the Conservative Manifesto in 2019, the government committed to 5 years extra healthy life by 2035, which no doubt felt a long way away when somebody wrote that manifesto. Now feels quite close. And there was an obesity strategy being developed to do that, because you can't make people healthier in old age if they only start being healthier when they're old. You have to start being healthier when you're young to have a healthy old age. And so I'm deeply alarmed by this thought that in a frenzy of deregulation, the government is going to tear up the obesity strategy and say, it's fine, just eat chips and chocolate when you're at school, and all will be well, because it won't. And it won't just make more people ill and therefore miserable in their old age. It will actually increase inequalities, because we all know the statistics of who are likely to take that bad advice. So my overall point is, and I'm sure others on the panel will have specific good suggestions of how to do this, but this does seem to me to be an area of policy where we've completely neglected it. Oh, not completely neglected, that's unfair, but we've neglected it too much over the decades, and where we're missing a huge opportunity. I chair the all-party group on longevity, and our basic idea is that the fact that we're all living longer, which we all celebrate as individuals, should not be seen by public policy as, oh God, another burden that the welfare state has to bear. It should be a matter for celebration. It will only be a matter for celebration if we all live our own lives trying our best to have a healthy old age, and if the state institutions help us do that. And we're not really doing either of those at the moment.
Thank you, Damian. A very, very eloquent overview there of the situation we're in. Just wanted to ask you one quick thing. Obviously, pensions have been in the news these last couple of weeks, and as you mentioned, it's one of the real areas of success. I think it's fair to say in terms of auto enrolment, and there was a real cross-party consensus around that, and indeed, we've been doing at Bright Blue some work around pensions in recent years. But there's clearly much more for pensions policy to do, and there seems to be less overt consensus around where next for pensions policy. So, how do you see pensions policy evolving?
I don't think there's necessarily a lack of consensus. It's just that we've not, as it were, moved beyond what you rightly identify. The auto enrolment has quietly been one of the big public policy successes of successive British governments from the early 2000s when the Blair government set up the Turner Commission on this, through the coalition, through the Conservative government since. We have all agreed that encouraging, not making it mandatory, but heavily encouraging people to spend an increasing amount of their income on saving for pensions has worked. And I remember seeing projections that as soon as you try to push it up above 1 or 2%, people will drop out, and they haven't actually. And I think the next phase for it is going to have to be to keep going on that, because although people are saving a lot more than they were 10, 15 years ago, they're still not saving enough. And there are various good suggestions out there. Again, it's something state institutions could do, is to make pretty compulsory a sort of financial MOT in your 40s, by which point you can be told, if you do that, then your standard of living when you're 70 will be that. Now, are you happy with that? If not, you're going to need to save more and maybe take some quite crunchy decisions about which holiday you go on every year for the next 5 years. It's that kind of practical stuff that we need to do more. So I don't observe any particular controversy in any of that, but I don't feel there's any huge energy to move on to the next step.
Thank you very much, Damian. And Carole, did you want to come in with some thoughts?
Yes, thank you. So just briefly, Centre for Ageing Better, where I'm Chief Exec, we produce annually a State of Ageing report, which is a comprehensive analysis of existing data sets. It may not surprise you that our report in 2022 unequivocally found that the state of ageing is getting worse, and that a financially secure and healthy later life is increasingly unlikely for millions of people. And there are multiple reasons for this. One of the reasons recently has been the rise to the age of 66 of the state pension age, which meant that the employment rates of people approaching retirement age have fallen to their lowest levels since 2016. The other factor is that there are the number of currently economically inactive people over 50 is nearly 3 million. So those inequalities are growing. Health, you touched on inequalities growing, and the healthy life expectancy is differing by as much as 17 years relating to levels of deprivation. So you can see that those inequalities are growing year on year. But one of the other factors is that older people are increasingly renting, so they're not in a financially secure position with financially kind of knowing exactly how much they're going to be able to afford or spend, because rents are also going to increase. So there's another reason that I would like to touch on, and one that we perhaps, well, I would say we definitely don't discuss enough, and that's ageism. You know, the ageist narratives that are kind of commonplace but have huge implications. So do we frame people, older people, as a burden, and our ageing population, as Damian has already said, as a crisis? Our ageing population, is it a crisis or is it an opportunity? Do we pit generations against one another, which in my view is a completely false fight, and implies there's a fight for resources? And do we lump older people together as wealthy homeowners when there's huge differences? And even the word pensioners suggests everyone over the age of 65 is the same, when in fact there's more than 1 in 5 people over 65 living in relative poverty, and that's more than 2 million people. And ageism isn't just about commission, it's not just about being patronising or ignoring older people, it's also about omission. And I think that's why it's so important that we address it, and we need to think about our ageing society. It isn't a luxury, it's an absolute imperative that we stop and do that now. Why? Thousands of older people are currently dying in their own homes, and this winter that's likely to get worse. Tens of thousands are having unnecessary accidents or unable to stay in their own homes because they're not suitable. Older people are losing out on mental health and physical health treatment, and more likely to be denied expensive, for example, talking therapies if they have mental health issues. And hundreds of thousands of people are unable to work. And I think the really important thing to say here is they want to. It's not, I hate the phrase economically inactive or out, you know, choosing to be out of work, because actually we know that millions of people want to work, but they don't have the right skills, they don't have the flexibility that allows them to fulfill caring responsibilities or even take care of their own health. And then also millions isolated in their own home because they can't access transport or their local services aren't friendly for those with disabilities. Ageism, I know, doesn't only affect older people, it affects younger people too. But I would really stress that policy solutions will benefit both young and old. In fact, they'll benefit everyone in society. So, for example, provision of accessible and energy efficient housing means all of us would pay less for energy, we'd have more options to stay in our own homes, both for ourselves and those for people we care about. If we make homes energy efficient, a national retrofit programme, for example, will help both health and financial well-being. That benefits the NHS and it benefits the economy. The right to really flexible working would help everyone in the workplace with other demands on their time, as would the provision of universal good health support at work. So just to give you an example that you might think would only benefit younger people, so the provision of high quality affordable childcare, but that would benefit, for example, grandparents who are very much involved these days in childcare, as I know from personal experience, and also allow younger people to save more for their pensions and for their own older age. I could carry on and give you many more examples, but I will resist. But I do challenge you to come up with a policy that benefits older people that won't benefit the rest of society as well. So, at Ageing Better, above all, we'd like to see the creation of an Older People's Commissioner. We'd like that role to help tackle ageism, to act as an independent champion for ageing and older people, to ensure that there's a cross-government approach to preparing for an ageing society. So this isn't just about older people, it's about the ageing society. And this is already in existence in Wales and Northern Ireland, so we know it happens, we know it works. And it's actually, in terms of voting, it's a popular idea. More than 2/3 of the public across the political spectrum support this, including younger people, so it isn't just old people. So I hope I've persuaded you that policy works across society when it works for older people.
Thank you, Carole. Striking a cautiously optimistic note there. And yes, we've heard a lot about economic inactivity, but it is worth, as you say, interrogating what's behind that, especially taking into account the wider barriers around ageism. So coming to Morgan next.
Thanks very much. Hello, everybody. My name's Morgan. I work for the national charity Independent Age. And for those of you who haven't heard of us yet, we're an organisation that support people aged 65 and over. We have a free helpline, an advice team you can talk to, lots of free information. We also give out grants to local community organisations, and we use all of the evidence that we gather through those routes to inform our policy and influencing and to try and work out what people in later life need to be able to enjoy their time in retirement. I think it's safe to say there are lots of people in later life having a great retirement. They're financially secure, they're enjoying their time, they might be volunteering, they might still be working. I'm going to try now to shine a little spotlight on those who aren't having a great time, just to put those into the conversation here. So, as Carole mentioned, there are over 2 million older people who don't have enough money to live on, and they're defined as being below the poverty line. So I'm just going to give a few examples of the calls that we've been getting just to put into context some of the challenges these people are facing. So a few weeks ago, we had a call to our helpline, a gentleman who's so worried about boiling the kettle during the day because of the electricity bill, that he set an alarm for 2 a.m, went downstairs, boiled it at the cheaper rate, put it in a thermos flask so that when he came down the next day, he had hot water. I've spoken to people who tell me they can't afford fresh fruit and vegetables. They're so worried the fruit and vegetables will go off that it would be a waste of money, that they now can no longer justify buying them. People who have told us they wear hats to bed. People telling us recently they're sitting in the dark rather than putting the lights on. And one gentleman called us asking for health advice of if he turned his fridge off overnight, would he be at risk of serious health problems? So just to give you a flavour of the types of calls that we're getting at the moment at the Independent Age helpline. And our vision and mission at Independent Age is to make sure that these voices from these groups of older people aren't missed out when we're thinking about this wider debate. And we want to make sure that those facing financial hardship are heard across the board. And I think another really important thing to say is when we look forward, this isn't just about cost of living right now. Yes, people are having an even worse time, but before the cost of living crisis really hit, the 2 million were already in poverty. We were getting these calls long before. I would just say they're getting worse and they're getting more frequent to our helpline. So as Carole's mentioned, we also think that an Older People's Commissioner could give a voice, an independent voice to people in government, to older people in government, to make sure that their issues are heard. People living in financial hardship often are so busy trying to work out how to pay their bills, they aren't necessarily having time to engage. They might be digitally excluded. Obviously, some people are offline by choice. Others can't afford to or can't be online because they've got health conditions. So that's another really important thing, that an Older People's Commissioner can make sure that those voices are heard. The other thing I wanted to flag is for those older people who are living in a situation where they don't have enough money coming in, the only option is how to cut their cost. There aren't many other options open to them about how they're going to increase their income, and they don't have the bandwidth to cope. So that's why we're hearing all these stories about people skipping meals, trying to turn their heating off as long as they can manage, because the only option is that they have to cut back on their costs. We're really welcoming of the government's support package on energy. It will give some older people in those situations we speak to some breathing space, but I think the important thing to say is some people in later life do use more energy. They're at home more. They might be living with long-term health conditions where they need the heating on because it is dangerous for them not to, and they're in their houses for more. particularly if they've got mobility problems and things like that. So the chances are that they will spend more than the 2,500 that's been documented. The other important thing is it's not just energy. People are calling us saying they're skipping food, they're skipping meals, they're reducing how much they eat. So it's not just energy. There are costs like food, rent we've heard about is a big problem. Water bills have been coming up in the groups that I've been visiting. People really worried about the cost of water. So that's one thing I'd say, that energy is only one element of all of this. The other thing is that we want to make sure that government is looking at solutions for now, but also longer term across the board. So we've got 3 that we think we want to raise with this group and that we think would really help older people on low income. So the first one is we think it is absolutely essential the government do uprate the state pension and also benefits for people of all ages, but that would include pension credit, uprated with inflation, because that is one way of helping people in later life who are on a fixed income to afford their bills. So that is one thing we think is absolutely essential. And doing that hopefully will reduce the need for emergency packages. And when we speak to older people, what they tell us on our helpline is these emergency packages, when they come, are welcome, but they're so anxious as they move closer to the deadline of when the bill is, and they don't know if they're going to be getting any support. So that's really important. The other thing that we're really keen on at Independent Age is we want a strategy from government about how to get pension credit to more older people. Now, for those in this room who don't know what pension credit is, as Damian mentioned earlier, some people don't get the new state pension, they get the old state pension, and it is not enough money to live on. So pension credit is a top-up that simply tops up people on the old state pension who are getting a very small amount of money, and it just brings them up in line with the new state pension. Many people don't get this, and often it's women who might have been out of the workplace caring for friends or family members. They get a reduced state pension, and they don't know that pension credit exists. To give you some context, the last official statistics, 850,000 households entitled to pension credit don't get it. 850,000 households missing out. That's 1.7 billion just that year, intended for the pockets of those older people. As I said, many whom have cared for friends or family, taken time out of the workplace to do that, don't get the money they're entitled to. The DWP has taken some action on pension credit take-up, but it's been broad, it hasn't been targeted, and although we've heard positive stats around how many people have put a claim in, we don't know how many of those have qualified and are getting that money, and that's what we really need to know, how many of those 850,000 missing out are going to receive that money. And then finally, as I mentioned, we do think that an older people's commissioner could help give older people in financial hardship and others a voice in government, be an independent voice, highlighting their issues and making sure that their voices are heard, particularly at the moment and in the future. The cost of living crisis is a problem right now, but we all know there are lots of problems that will continue as we move forward. So we want to make sure that there's a voice for older people, an independent voice in government that will support older people and make sure that their voices are heard.
Thank you, Morgan. And obviously, there's a need for permanent policy shifts. I think we can all agree. But do you see any opportunities in the cost of living crisis to bring some more attention to the issues we're talking about?
Yes, so some people in this room might know this, but when the former Chancellor announced the cost of living package in May, much of which would have helped older people on low income, one of the big problems was there was an announcement of a payment, I think it was £650, to people who are on low income. And the way of identifying that is that they receive a means-tested benefit. Now, pension credit is not received by nearly 40% of those entitled to it. So the Chancellor in his speech said, I can't use pension credit to get the money to the people on low income because I don't know who they are, because 40% of them aren't getting it. He didn't go into that level of detail, but we know that. So the Chancellor had to take action which was much broader, which is costing more money, because the Chancellor had to be sure that everyone in later life who might be living in a cold home, have a long-term condition that's getting worse because they're not eating properly, he had to make sure that that money got to those groups. So if you could increase pension credit uptake and you could confidently say, we are absolutely sure that that money is being received by the groups in most need, the cost of living supports could be more easy to deliver, and you would know that you were targeting the right groups. So there's definitely opportunities within this to look at things like, to be ambitious, think about automation. Like, is there a way that government could automate pension credit so there's not a big long application process and people don't have to find out about it or hear about it from a friend or family member if they're lucky. So I think there's lots of opportunities.
Yeah. Thank you. So fashionably late, finally, we have Ben.
As ever. Yeah, sorry for joining you slightly late. Great to be with you today, talking about what I think is one of the very biggest issues facing our country, facing our society, the ageing population we face, the challenges that poses for helping and looking after those in their older years, but also, of course, building an economy that is capable of doing that and a health service that is capable of doing that. I've got to start, I think, with a warning, which is that from what I see in my work in Westminster and Whitehall, there is a consistent failure in Whitehall and in government to foresee these problems and deal with them as they arise, before they arise. We saw that with pandemic planning, we're seeing, I think, with the rise of artificial intelligence, we're seeing with climate change, and this is another example of where I think policymakers and politicians have been far too slow to respond to some of the challenges that these issues pose. And nowhere is that clearer, I would say, than in the state of social care in this country at the moment, which is an absolute frank disgrace that has been neglected and underfunded by governments of all stripes for decades. There is still no plan in place to deal with that. The Health and Social Care Levy was supposed to increase funding. It's been scrapped. What is going to happen to social care? Because so many people, many of them elderly, not all of them, are being badly let down by a social care system that does not work to the extent that it should. Carers are leaving in their droves. They're calling our shows on LBC all the time saying they're paid nowhere near enough to live on. The cost of living is making it impossible to carry on in their jobs. They are being overworked, underfunded, and they're leaving. We've seen the same with nurses. That has to stop. That has to change. I don't know what the plan is. I don't know what the solution is. It strikes me there will need to be some pretty difficult conversations and some pretty tough decisions around taxation and so on. But there has to be a cross-party agreement, I would think, on a long-term funding settlement for social care that actually fixes this problem once and for all. And that means social care not just being about, not being an emergency service, not only being there where people are really, really desperate. Some of the issues that we've talked about could be dealt with much better by a fully funded, well-resourced social care sector that can deal with things like prevention, that can step in if somebody is isolated, is lonely, can provide the sort of support, can get involved with social prescribing and so on. Because another thing we see on LBC, and we saw particularly in the pandemic, but also too, is the levels of isolation and loneliness. People calling into our shows because the voice of the presenter might be the only voice that they hear that day. Now that is not, again, something that we can tolerate, that we want to see going forward. And I think it's not all about social care, and I'll come on to that, but social care should have a key role in helping people who maybe physically they're okay, but in those sorts of situations being that point of access at a time when obviously GPs are also massively overstretched. And I think that is a challenge. I'll come on to the economic challenges in a moment, but that sense of isolation and loneliness, I think it's worth touching on. It's not something the state can solve by itself. And I think a lot of the solutions to some of the issues that have been posed do come back to a community, a society, a sense of looking out for each other, a sense of building a sort of cohesive, coherent society. My worry is that that's fractured. It can't be that the state has to do everything. It certainly can't be the national government can do everything. I think local councils have a big, big role to play. Their budgets have been massively eroded in recent years. That has had a huge impact on people locally too. But also it's about building that society that looks out for each other. And that brings me on to the sort of issue of generational divides. I think it's massively overstated. I've done phone-ins on LBC and myself when we talk about intergenerational inequality. Is it fair that the young are consistently missing out when policy decisions are made? And what you find, it's quite horrible, is you get droves of younger people calling in saying, absolutely not, we should be looking after those in old age, they've worked hard all their lives, they should be the priority. And then you get people who are retired or people who are in their later years calling in saying, yes, it's totally unfair, the young people are being completely neglected, my grandchildren can't get my housing now. It's really horrible. So this idea that there is sort of this big divide, young people are all resentful and older people are sort of creaming off, it just isn't reality. But I do worry that there is a growing sense of resentment amongst younger generations about some of the policy decisions that have been made. As we've heard, investing in people in their older years benefits everybody. But I do think these sorts of conversations we're having at the moment about protecting the state pension, which is absolutely right, There is no way the state pension cannot be increased by anything less than inflation. It would be awful to do so. I'd call us this weekend, an elderly man sleeping in his car because he can't work because he's got arthritis in his knee. It's £130 universal credit a month, and he's sleeping in his car because it's a choice between that or sleeping on the street. Had an elderly lady who has turned the heating off apart from 1 hour a day and was almost in tears on the phone because she says, I'm worried about myself, I'm worried about my kids, I don't know how I'm going to get through this winter. She relies on state pension, gets pension credit, it's still not enough. And I said to her, if those are cut, what would happen? And she said, I can't bear to think about it, I'm absolutely terrified. So it's not a trade-off, but at the same time, as Morgan was saying, a lot of people also rely on other benefits. A lot of people in older age and also younger people. So I think that the sense that I'm getting at this conference is the government is not going to be able to get anything other than an inflation matching uplift in benefits through Parliament. And I think that is absolutely right. Because there is a fear, if you say, okay, protect the state pension, but we're going to slash benefits for everyone else, that sense of cohesion that I think is there, it does start to fracture. And I do think that truly protecting people in their later years does also require investing in younger people who, when it comes to the economy, are going to need to buy into this idea of everyone being in it and everyone helping everyone. And again, that's going to need some tough decisions. When it comes to the workforce, there needs to be frank conversations about how we maintain an economy and a health service, given the changes we're going through. And on things like immigration and filling some of the gaps we've got in areas like the NHS and social care, there needs to be a very, very honest conversation. We're about time, so I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Ben. So before we head over to questions, I thought, Damian, you might want to come in a bit on the points Ben was raising around social care. So see, the health and social care levy was the latest in a fairly long line of attempts to fix social care, and that seems to have blown up really. So yeah, do you see a way forward now after the health and social care levy to make some progress?
I can see a way forward. Whether the government will follow it, I don't know. The one point I would add to Ben's analysis of what's gone wrong with that policy is that it's a problem that it's always done by the Department of Health, because the Department of Health and Social Care, as it now is, in the end is most concerned with the health service. It is the department for running the NHS. And so social care, however much you try, always tends to be second order. And when I was First Secretary of State, I took social care in as my personal responsibility, because it seemed to me then, and it still does now, that if you're actually going to have a proper social care policy, it needs to be driven from the top of government. And because not only is it a health issue, it is also a housing issue, and obviously it's also a fiscal issue. So you actually need different parts of government working together. And the great thing that's bedeviled it is that it has always been a slightly second order sort of Friday afternoon issue inside the Department of Health. And sadly we've gone back to that. But yes, I mean, there are, actually, can I do a plug here? Anyone doing nothing after this is finished. At 2:30, I'm speaking about social care at a meeting by another think tank. Other think tanks are available at the Crown Plaza, along with good people like Camilla Cavendish, who's written a brilliant book about social care and how it's done often better around the world. But I mean, it does need more money, however you get there. I mean, I would fund it in a different way than taxation. I think some of, those, particularly those older people who are rich and comfortable and have got, frankly, huge amounts of housing wealth, I think a sliver of that spent on them buying insurance against the possibility of social care would fund quite a significant part of the social care system. So it needs more money, but it also, above all, needs a proper workforce plan. Unless we have one, then you will continue to have these terrible numbers of people stuck in hospital because they can't get out. They can't get out because there are no care workers to look after them. So the workforce is one key issue. Organisation, the new integrated care boards, which started in the summer, ought to be the ideal opportunity for avoiding the problem I identify, which is that social care and health are not on an equal footing. My fear is that the integrated care boards will, as ever, become run by and for the benefit of the big hospitals, and that the social care voice will not be heard loudly enough at the table. and I keep making this point to ministers. And the other point I would make, to sort of revert to funding, is that the continuing to try and fund social care out of local authority budgets is a nonsense. The local authorities will just become care providers with a few libraries attached. I mean, you just look at those demographics I set out at the start. You know, a proportion of those people will need care. The local authorities can't cope. So what we have now is that every year central government bungs some sticking plaster money in, quite a lot in, to keep the system running for another year. And I heard yesterday, another fringe from a director of social services, that's a way of making sure you spend the money inefficiently. You can't do long-term planning. You can't try anything innovative because you've just got to spend this money when central government gives it to you. So I think you've got to reform the funding, you've got to have a proper workforce plan, and you've got to integrate it much better with the health service.
Great. So I think we have 30 minutes or so for questions. So just a reminder for the denizens of the internet that you can ask questions through the Slido link located next to or below the video player. But we'll take some questions from the room first. So if you just wait for the roaming mic and then just give your name and organisation. So we'll go first over here.
I wondered, has it been considered of encouraging the family to look after their elderly parents more by way of giving them some kind of incentive? I mean, it's absolutely heartbreaking hearing that some of the stories that you were telling us about, Morgan. So I'm looking at China, for example. I believe that they give some sort of penalty if you don't go and visit your parents. So that's not actually what I'm proposing, but some sort of incentive. And if you don't have children to come and see you, maybe you could get some sort of credit for that, because of course you're not taking potentially you're not using the parks and the swimming pools and public services. The other thing is, in respect of loneliness and perhaps not quite having enough money at the age of the general retirement age of 65, 66, 67, do you think people are really ready to sit at home all day or just be at home with the grandchildren, or could they possibly be used perhaps in the public sector, schools, NHS, police, in the middle of a sort of a cross between a voluntary basis and a paid basis? So it's something to keep them occupied. They've got a lot of skills that they've accrued, and it's helping, perhaps the public sector funding as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we can take a couple more in this round. I think just lady in the green coat here.
My name's Sue Kay, and I live in London. And I'm looking at the board behind Damian, which says, what issues matter most to you? And I've marked the panellists in terms of what they said in their speech, and also the literature we put in the bag. And I'm afraid to say that Morgan gets 2 out of 2. Sam and Carole, you get 0 out of 2. Because, Morgan, you were the only people who highlighted the biggest problem that I have faced for the last 3 years since I've been unable to use the computer. Digital exclusion is that you were the only one to mention it, Morgan. The other 2 of you ignored it completely. And it's not a small thing. It affects every part of my life. I have a row virtually every day that I can't get things, whether it's the bank, the building society, voluntary groups, whatever, that they can only allow me to access them by phone. You were talking about the heartbreaking things you had on the phone. You mentioned people phoning. Neither of you even thought to mention it. And your literature, for both of you, accessed by internet only. Now, there's reckoned to be about 3 million people over the age of 65 who do not have internet access. For some people, a new machine or some training would help. For the vast majority of them, they are like me. It's health issues, it's sight, it's arthritis, it's dementia, it's a whole range of things. And we are being ignored and thrown on the scrap heap. And to have to fight, as I do virtually every day, is not acceptable. So what do I want? I'd love to see an elderly persons commissioner who makes it mandatory, legal, that you always have to have offline access. Age UK is the most wonderful organisation I've ever come across. And through their auspices, I did an article for them which they have published as a blog on their website. Please look it up. The title of my article is I'm Not Dead, I'm Just Offline. I've been interviewed by the Telegraph and the Standard. The Telegraph interviewed me because they were concerned that people who cannot have internet access do not get the best savings plans. That's correct. But I could take that to every single organisation, and it is awful that people like yourselves do not even consider it worth a mention. So please, when your literature is produced, Carole, of the Centre for Ageing Better, put a telephone number on, put an address on. If you want me to participate in your group, Sam, put a telephone number on, put an address on. And Morgan, I'll be talking to you to thank you again, because you're the only person I can talk to on an ongoing basis.
Thank you. Just one more question. I think we have one at the back there.
Paul Tennant, the Chief Exec of the Abbeyfield Society, a national organisation. So Paul Tennant, the Chief Exec of the Abbeyfield Society, Sorry, just trying to get this. Is that better?
Yeah, we can hear you back here.
Paul Tennant, I'm the Chief Exec. Everybody's heard this several times now. Abbeyfield Society. Good PR, this is working marvellously. It's about social care, Ben's point. I was at an event earlier today. We don't seem to be able to get the debate around social care right. We don't seem to get the right factors. I was being told this morning the issue is the NHS isn't efficient enough. That's the reason we have problems with social care. That is the issue about older people. It's a small number of people who are involved. It baffles me how that can be the nature of the narrative. So I'm just wondering how we get a proper discussion around social care based on data, insight, and trying to get some real outcomes. And Ben's point about trying to get cross-party. I've been in the sector for 30, 40 years. We've talked about cross-party. It never happens because housing and care are both political footballs that get kicked about on a regular basis.
Okay, so tackling loneliness, digital exclusion, and raising the calibre of the debate around social care. I mean, Carole, do you want to come in on some of those points?
Yes, thank you. I mean, I think one of the themes, and it has been touched on, is that social care isn't just about social care, it's also about prevention, and that enabling people to live safely and healthily in their own homes is important too for families to be able to care for the people that matter to them. So I don't have a view on a financial incentive, as was raised, but I do have a view that we should be making a one-stop shop available to older people and their families so that they can access good support in their homes, whether that be a small amount of money to make adaptations, because many people wouldn't choose to go into care homes if they could stay in their own homes, whether that be to make them energy efficient, but also to build trust with, it's not easy to have work done on your own home, let's face it, even if you're able, and to make those contacts, to really trust that you're going to get the right thing. So we are very much in favour of those one-stop shops, and that people's homes should be made safe and efficient, and I think that would help family support. In terms of are people ready to retire, I would say in a number of ways people are often not ready to retire, whether they've reached 65 or before 65. A lot of people we know step down out of work because of health conditions. If they were better supported at work, they'd probably stay in longer. They probably don't realise, too, from research recently, that actually their pensions are not, what they've saved in their pensions is not going to be sufficient to survive. So I think we need to look at ageist practice at work, which also encourages older people to stay in work or return to work, whether that be because they've chosen themselves or they've been made redundant. And certainly some of the work we're doing at the centre is how you encourage people and support them, whether that be with training, and you talk about lifelong learning, which is not working for younger people, it's not working definitely for older people at the moment. So I think there's a number of policy changes that we need and local practice to enable older people to stay in work as well. The Older People Commissioner, I think, would help, and I take your point about digital. It is something we've looked at in the past at Ageing Better. It isn't a focus of our activity at the moment, but I take your point 100% that we need to look at our own practice and how we're communicating. So I do commit to taking that back to the office tomorrow.
Thank you.
So Ben, quite a wide-ranging set of points. Yeah, do you want to come in?
Well, the point on social care is the key one. The idea that the NHS isn't inefficient and that's the cause of the problem is nuts, frankly. I talk to people in the NHS a lot. There are huge knock-on effects from the failings in social care at the moment on the NHS. I think people know that. The number of people having to stay in hospitals taking up beds when they don't need to be in hospital because there's no one to discharge them to. The number of people who are ending up in A&E when actually they don't need to be there because there's no one else to step in earlier. And that's before you even get into the preventative element. And it's not just health too. We talked a lot in recent weeks about failings in policing, people not turning up for burglaries and so on. And when you talk to police officers, they say more and more, I'm having to deal with cases that social care and mental health services should be dealing with, and which they are not qualified to deal with. When the care in the community hasn't turned up if someone's having a mental health crisis, when police are having to go around to check on an elderly relative because someone's concerned about their welfare, it has huge knock-on impacts on all sorts of other policy areas. And Damian touched on it. Damian said it's a Friday afternoon issue in the Department of Health. I mean, that is, I've no reason to doubt it. I think that is how it's treated in government, and I absolutely do not understand it. It is a total dereliction of duty from, and it's not just one party, it's been consistent for decades. It was not fixed under the Labour government, it certainly hasn't been fixed under Tory governments, despite repeated promises. I wonder if part of it is, in response to the question as to why, is because people don't really understand what social care is. I think when you talk about the NHS, everyone has an image of a GP or a A&E. People can picture it. Whereas unless you are reliant on social care or know someone who is, I think it's this sort of vague term, and therefore maybe doesn't have the political importance in the minds of voters and therefore politicians that perhaps it should. But it absolutely needs to change. How that happens, I'm not so sure. On the point about digital exclusion as well, incredibly powerful point. I think it's absolutely right that a lot of organisations, private and public sector, have put a lot of work into making their buildings physically accessible and thinking about that. But if their own websites and their own literature doesn't cater towards people who, for health reasons or other reasons, can't access the internet, that's frankly not good enough. It's almost, I'm not saying it's legally discriminatory, but it is by impact discriminatory.
The Policy Act of 2010 makes it mandatory for you to make suitable accommodation. And I've been through the arbitrator. They've held in my favour. With one case, I've got another one with them. But it's not a legal body, and I don't want to live in solicitor's office, and I don't want to go through this.
But you shouldn't have to.
I shouldn't
is the point. Is the point. And I think it's something that is, you're right to say, often neglected. I'm going to go read your article, and I think you raised it really powerfully. And just lastly, the point about sort of incentivising people to look. I'm an optimist. I hope that people know their parents need help, that they will want to do so. The problem is at the moment there's so many people having to work longer hours, 2 jobs, 3 jobs, look after the kids because childcare is so expensive that the knock-on impact is people have less time. And that means that obviously there is an issue, I think, particularly if people are living further away from elderly relatives and so on. But I go back to my point about the sort of broader society. Maybe it sounds utopian and a bit almost sort of naive, but I would like to get back to a point maybe, where it doesn't all fall on the children, where neighbours and community leaders and that sense of social society, the big society as David Cameron famously called it, steps in again. And I'm talking from quite a London perspective, but where we live, there's no sense of community. If you were ill, your neighbours would never know. There's no people locally, and I think that could take a lot of pressure off the immediate family, who I would like to believe do their best, but are, in many people's cases, in difficult circumstances.
Morgan, is there anything you wanted to
Yeah,
pick up on?
just a couple of points. So on the digital exclusion point, I think the key thing for all of us is to think about how diverse everybody in that age bracket is. If you think about 65 to 105, you know, everybody in that group is going to be different. And I wouldn't want to make judgments on people not being online, the same as I wouldn't want to make judgments of them being online. So I think it's really important for you know, every organisation who's providing material, every government department, to make sure that it is accessible in multiple formats, and to think about how we're communicating to all the different groups that might be living age 65 and over. I just wanted also to come in on the point about incentivising and caring. I think one thing to say is there is a big financial problem at the moment, because a lot of people might, one of the big reasons why older people end up living in poverty is they have done that and they've taken the time out. So I take your point that potentially if you could support them financially to do that for a family member, that would be positive. The only caveat that I personally would give, and this is my personal opinion, so my nan had Parkinson's and Lewy body dementia. She hallucinated people were trying to kill her. She tried to jump off the balcony. She thought there were people in her flat. It was very, very distressing for her. There is absolutely no way our family could help her in a way that was appropriate. And I remember speaking to somebody whose husband had dementia, the same actually as my nan's, Lewy body, which is a really nasty one. And she said it was like having a baby. She said he wakes up all night, he gets out of bed, he falls down. I don't get any sleep. It's like having a newborn, but he's an adult and I can't lift him. I can't get him back into bed safely. I can't get him out the bath on my own. So I take your point, but I do think there are times where family, despite the best will in the world, just need the help of people who are trained to support. So that's the only thing I'd say on that.
And Damian, finally, coming to you.
Yeah, sorry.
So we had a range of things, but tackling loneliness, digital exclusion, more about the discussion around social care. Any way you want to come in on those?
I mean, so, not to repeat what other people have said, on the first point about loneliness and so on, I should say, you won't have seen this, but because I've got the audience in front of me, when you talked about punishing people for not visiting their elderly parents often enough, there was a lot of nervous smiles from some of the younger people in the room, I can tell you. So you have done some good. Consciences will have been pricked. Everyone will be visiting Mum this weekend. What older people do, in a way, is less important than that they do something. All the evidence about long-term health decline and so on is that the best way to avoid it is a sense of purpose. If you have some purpose in your life, and it can come from volunteering, it can come from helping a family, or it can come from a job. And if you're fit and well enough to do it, then having that purpose in later life is the best thing to do, and I think we don't do enough to encourage people in that. I completely agree. Digital exclusion, you make a very powerful case, there's no doubt about that. And I'm interested, one of the things I do is sit on the DCMS Select Committee, and we have taken evidence on digital exclusion. And I'm struck, I can't quite remember what the details of it was, but nothing was as personal and powerful as that. So the people lobbying about digital exclusion, it seems to me, are not very good at putting their case forward.
Next time you're doing it, give me a call.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah, no, you'd be a great witness. And raising the standard of debate, I mean, yes, of course, we'd like to, but I mean, it doesn't feel to me like debating social care is the problem. It's actually doing something about it. We've been debating it for decades, as Ben says, and it slightly falls into the too difficult, as Ben said, because it's not properly defined in a way, but it also falls into the category of if you get it slightly wrong and it's a bit second rate, then nobody's going to riot. So I'm afraid it requires people inside the system constantly to raise its salience to make sure that effectively governments are pushed into acting, because external events are not going to make them act.
Okay, well, I think we have probably time for another round of three. So going to gentleman at the end of the row here.
Hello, Jay Dominy from the Association of British Insurers, and as most of you know, that also means we represent a lot of pension providers in the UK as well. One thing that we've noticed, and this is probably a problem you've also all noticed as well, people don't want to think about their older age. It's a particular problem with social care. So when looking at market solutions to social care, a big barrier is that people don't want to even look into the product because they don't want to expect that they're going to need to use them. People don't want to think about their pensions until it's too late often. Just interested as to what the panel thinks the solutions to that are. Is there room for more defaults? Is there room for better engagement from government? Yeah, just interested for thoughts.
And I think we had a gentleman here and a lady at the front.
Hi, Sam from ARCO, with a representative body for housing with care providers. On the social care issue, as well as the critical questions around funding and the workforce, there's also the question of how and where social care is provided in today's world, and interested in what the panel think about what the balance needs to be in future between provision of social care in care homes. Should it be provision of social care in people's own homes? Should it be housing with care, extra care? There are also kind of new models of intergenerational care where younger people are helping to care for older people. So that kind of social care landscape, what should it look like? Where exactly should the social care be provided in future?
Hi, I'm Anne Fairweather from Hargreaves Lansdowne. Building slightly on the point Jay was making, actually, I think there are two aspects to this. There's one around dealing with people who've got problems in the here and now, and there's a second one around how do we build people's financial resilience so they are in a better place in the future. And I think it's very difficult in a policy environment to sometimes deal with that thing that isn't a problem now, but if you tackle it now, in 20 years' time, it's going to improve. And I think we see there's a big role potentially for financial firms in being able to help and guide people to understand what is actually a very complicated sort of set of circumstances later in life. And Carole mentioned, for example, that many old people will be renting. Now if you put money into like a pensions calculator, think, will I have enough for later life? It assumes that you have paid off your mortgage. It assumes you won't have housing costs. So how do we as a sector build better tools and better ways? And I do think with some of the ways digital experiences can work, the way we can do data analytics in the future, it should be much more possible for us to give much more detailed and more personalised guidance to people. And there's a separate conversation with the regulator about how we allow ourselves to do that safely. But I think to the lady's point here as well, it's incredibly important that we make sure that some of those digital solutions are actually accessible for all. But I think maybe the challenge to the panel is how do we also keep an eye on that sort of 20-year time horizon and trying to make sure that we're trying to correct the path on the way in as well.
Coming first to you, Carole, did you want to tackle any of those?
Yes, sure. I mean, the issue about people don't want to think about older age, you know, we're going to be running a lot of work over the next years at Centre for Ageing Better on ageism. Because actually we're ageist about ourselves too. You say people don't want to think about it. It's partly because it's got so many negative associations. So I think it's about time that as a nation we start challenging those negative associations. Damian said it's an opportunity. Let's change the language. You know, we look at the language in which older people are portrayed in the media, in politics, you know, in the press. It's not surprising in a way that we don't want to think about it, when in fact a lot of the evidence shows that people are happier and more content in their 60s and 70s than they ever were before. So we need to change the narrative, and I really think that can't be overstated, because actually it does go on to influence policy and practice. So I think that's both about a kind of public challenge, a narrative challenge, a challenge to ourselves, but also to government to bring in an ageing strategy. This isn't just about older people. As I say, this is about, Damian touched on right at the beginning, this affects everyone in our nation, that the population demographics are changing, and as a country we're not really looking at what the implications are, not just about care, but about housing, about work, about volunteering, about digital. It goes across anything that you can think of in government. So I really feel that has to be an imperative. And the other questions about financial resilience, I do think we would support the idea of midlife MOT, not just being about how much money have you got, but these longer term plans that you might need to put in place, and some of the realities about what the future holds, and also greater investment in support for people who are out of work so they can really consider, and that does need to be not just branded JCP but also independent and local community support for people to get back into work.
Damian, do you want to touch on any of those points, perhaps midlife MOT?
I completely agree with everything Carole said, so I won't repeat any of it. Maybe the midlife MOT, yes, of course. I mean, I think there's no point making it mandatory because the people who don't want to do it won't turn up, and it would just be a waste of everyone's time. But a much greater encouragement of it seems to me would be a significant step forward, the way auto-enrolment is. On housing, absolutely, we tend to have the care debate in terms of care homes, and actually, as I think a lot of the panel have said, it should be as much more about allowing people to live in their own homes for longer, leading their normal lives for longer than it is. And that's partly about the way we design and adapt and build houses. We don't build anything like enough houses in which people who may well be frail and in some cases very elderly, but who can live perfectly safely and happily ahead. We don't build enough of that. We should build a lot more. I think the planning system should be changed to allow that, or encourage that, or indeed mandate that. But also, we've only scratched the surface of the use of technology in terms of allowing people to lead, as it were, normal life, lead their traditional life, and not have to either have somebody there all day, every day, or go into a home. One brief and trivial example, that for most people, Alexa is a toy. Actually, if you're bedbound or chair-bound, it can literally be a lifesaver, but even if not that, the ability to have a machine that tells you it's 11 in the morning, take your red pill, if you've got early stages of dementia or something like that, or even an intelligent fridge that will tell your carer, relative, whatever, it's 2 o'clock and the fridge door hasn't been opened all day, nobody's eaten in this house today, it'll do something about that. All of those kinds of things, which are not cutting-edge technology, they're all available now. If we use them a lot more, made a much bigger proactive effort to get them into more people's houses, I suspect, first of all, you would find hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people leading happier lives for longer. You would also save huge amounts of money on the care budget, which would make the wider care debate we've had easier to solve.
Morgan, perhaps you'd like to come in.
Yeah, I'll just come in on a few points. So I think you asked sort of how and where should social care be provided. My answer would be wherever the person who needs that care wants it to be provided, if it is safe to do so. So some people, I know this might come as a shock, but some people do want to go to a care home and want that companionship and want the activities, and if that's their choice, great. If they want to remain in their own home and it's safe to support them to do so, then that's the option that should be considered. And I think the key thing for the people we speak to, because Independent Age does give advice on social care to older people, is that people have a choice. A lot of older people aren't told about their choices and their options, so they might go into hospital at crisis point and literally just be put in the closest care home that can be found at that time. And it might not be good quality, it might not be where they want to be, it might not be close to friends and family, but it's an emergency response to what's happened. So I think making sure that they know what their options are is really important, as we would want for people of any age. And just to come in on the point of later life, I think you make a really important point about renting costs not being factored into calculators and things like that. The older renter cohort is going to be absolutely enormous, and things like the state pension were designed making an assumption that everybody does own their house and has paid off their mortgage, and that's not going to be the case for a lot of older people. So I guess there's two things in my mind. We need to find out more about that group and what would support them, and make sure that housing benefit is adequate and can help them if they need it. But also the triple lock. The triple lock is often seen, as panellists said earlier, as something for people in later life. It isn't. It's for all of us as we move through our lives. So if there are people now living on low income, we need the state pension to be decent when people of all ages get there, including the people who are there now. So I think the government doing things like protecting the triple lock is for everybody, and hopefully it will mean that as people reach retirement age, there's something there that they can rely on in a more robust way.
So, coming finally to Ben, rounding out the panel.
Yeah, just to agree with everything that Morgan and Damian said on housing. I'm glad a couple of people brought it up. It is at the heart, like social care, at the heart of so many issues. The question of where should care be provided, as Morgan says, we want to surely allow people to live independently in their own homes for as long as they possibly can. And there are some brilliant supported housing providers doing that. But a lot of those providers rely on benefits, on social security, pay to their tenants to allow them to provide those services, provide those sorts of homes, let alone build more. So again, it all comes back, a lot of it, I think, to welfare. But the other point on housing is, Damian's absolutely right to say that planning could be used to make developers build more of that sort of accommodation. But also we need to get councils building again so that they can do so without necessarily the profit incentive. They can focus much more on building the sorts of homes, not that will make them the most money, but that people in those areas most need. And Michael Gove was doing some very good work before he was quite brutally ousted from government on social housing. I hope the new Levelling Up Secretary and Housing Secretary, Simon Clark, will continue that. Theresa May started talking a lot about it again. So there has been a pivot, I think, in the last few years, from the Cameron Osborne years where social housing was basically abandoned, towards again recognising the importance of it, because housing costs come through to absolutely everything. And if we can build more homes, build more of the sorts of homes that people need in their areas, then that of course will also help those who are renting, because rents are going through the roof at the moment. This idea, you know, you've got a lot of young people obviously struggling too, but as we've been hearing, a lot of elderly people are as well. So a lot of it comes back to that, I think. Just last on the point about pensions, how we incentivise it. I'm not an expert on how we incentivise people to save, but I do know a lot of people at the moment can't afford to do so because their wages aren't enough, the cost of living has gone through the roof, their benefits are potentially going to be frozen, I don't think that will happen, and their housing costs have gone up. The other point I just make on that is a lot of people I speak to are choosing effectively between, well, they're not choosing, they've got a choice. They would like to put more of their pensions when they're younger, but they're having to pay off huge amounts of debts that have been accrued, partly university, but also people are studying to be a nurse and had their bursaries cut. They are desperate to be a nurse. They've gone through the training process, lengthy, arduous, and they've got tens of thousands of pounds of debt. So if you say to that person, you're already struggling with the cost of living, you've got to pay off this debt for the next 15, 20, 30 years, you can try and incentivise them to put more money into their pension, but frankly, they're not going to be able to do so. So I think a lot of it comes back to that as well. Are there people who could afford to do more and plan ahead? Yes, but there's a lot that could.
Thank you, Ben. So just to wrap up quickly, because I'm aware Damian has to be somewhere very soon. Thank you all for coming again, and thank you to Independent Age and the Centre for Ageing Better for partnering with us and making this event possible. And thank you to, of course, all of our panellists for very eloquently speaking at this panel. So you are welcome to stay and mingle in the room for a while before we have our next event in this room. That will be at 3:30. It's called Leading the Chase, Levelling Up Managerial Skills. You can sign up to be a member of Bright Blue. We have a discounted £10 price for party conference. If you speak to one of the team in the room, they can give you more details about that. So yes, thank you all for coming, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.